Bienvenidos, mi nombre es Angélica Bernabé, soy la directora del Centro especializado en Tartamudez y hoy una vez más estamos haciendo esta serie de videos con expertos internacionales en diferentes áreas de la tartamudez. Hoy día tengo el placer de estar con Alison Berquez. Ella es parte del equipo de terapeutas del Centro de Tartamudez de Londres o el Michael Palin Centre for Stammering. Y el tema de hoy es la terapia breve enfocada en la solución aplicada al tratamiento de la tartamudez, o como se le llama en inglés, Solution Focused Brief Therapy. Alison ha presentado este tema recientemente, en enero de este año 2021, para el Congreso de Oxford. Ella es certificada en este tema, en Brief, en este enfoque. Entonces, para mí, en verdad, me emociona bastante. Creo que todos los que trabajamos en Tartamudez hemos escuchado alguna vez sobre Alison, entonces estoy muy feliz también por ello, que esté aquí con nosotros. Thank you, Ali. I'm very happy to have you here and that we can talk about solution-focused approach.
Thank you, Angélica. I'm really pleased to be here. And I love talking about solution-focused brief therapy.
Me too. So, well, I want to start this video asking you a very general question, because I know that for this approach will be new for a lot of therapists, as it was to me. So my first question is, what is solution-focused brief therapy or solution-focused approach?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. It was developed in the States, and it was an approach that was developed by a team in Milwaukee, Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg, who were both therapists and actually happened to be married as well. But what was really interesting is they just started observing what worked in therapy and meticulously noting down what worked in therapy. And from that, the solution-focused approach was born. So rather than being theoretically driven, although it has some philosophical underpinnings, it's very much come from a process of observation, thinking about what works in therapy and in the therapeutic relationship. Yes. And in essence, it's about focusing on the solutions, what works, and helping clients to pay attention to that and to do more of it.
Yes, and that's one interesting thing that I have to confess that the first time I heard about this, I was like a bit confused, but we are not going to ask them about the problem. We are going to jump to the solution now. I was like a bit confused, but then when I started to read, and with a certification, I started to learn that it could be a bit different in that way, but also give us a lot of tools to work, and also to work with people who stutter or stammer, I would say, in London. And that's my next question. How do you consider this approach can help people who stammer?
Yeah, I think you're right that it was seen as really radical at first. People tend to think that you come to a professional and talk about your problem. And so this approach really turns things on its head, because actually what you're doing is saying, what do you want from the therapy process? What does it look like when you get to where you want to? And I suppose for people who stammer, that has real application, because they're used to talking about the stammering and the difficulties that may bring to their lives, as opposed to thinking about the things that they want. And so solution-focused conversations really help them to think about where they're trying to get to, what they want from coming into therapy. And there's something really empowering about that. So instead of us as professionals kind of working within our own assumptions about what a person may need or we ought to do for them, it's much more about collaborating with them, understanding what they want, what brings them to therapy at that particular time, and how we can navigate them towards that and to sort of help them to move in helpful directions.
Yes. And another thing I like that I just remember now is how also can help to realize, to highlight the things they are doing well. Really, because that could be confusing for them to realize at the beginning, but with this kind of questions and activities that this approach have, they also can realize and say, oh, well, I'm doing a lot of things well now, like I can continue doing this thing. So that's also very, very nice.
Yeah, I agree, because for many of us, well, most of us, we tend to focus on the negatives. We kind of remember the 1 or 2% of things that didn't go quite as we wanted to, and focus on that, rather than focusing on the majority of life, which maybe is going in a more helpful direction. So this approach very deliberately helps people pay attention to the good stuff, to what works, to what's helping them already, albeit that it's often tiny, tiny signs of change as opposed to really big signs of progress. But then what happens is, over time, if we think about change as being a very slow, layered process, over time they start to notice the good things and begin to look out for more of them.
Yes, and another thing that Jane mentioned, and actually I think she showed us some videos, is how you also can use this with, I mean, not only with the person who stutters or stammers, but also with their parents, because sometimes they are having that too. They are still looking only the things that they consider are not going well, instead of looking at the changes that are happening already.
Absolutely. And at the Michael Palin Centre, we place a real emphasis on working with the whole family system. So working with parents is kind of just part of what we do every day. And I think the way the process works is really gradual, respectful. It's, in some ways, it's quite a gentle process, because you go at the pace of the client. So wherever a family starts, whether it's a younger child or a young person or an adult, or if it's somebody where you're working with parents, you start from where they are as opposed to where you think they ought to be, and then gradually help them towards what they want.
Yes, and what you mentioned is very important, because sometimes it could happen that well-intended therapists, they think that they know what the person wants, but with this kind of question that this approach give us, is so much easier to see or to realize what they really want, instead of what we want for them.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it helps us as professionals to really collaborate. So I've been looking at what parents want and what children want from therapy over the past few years, working with a team in Iowa led by Patricia Zabrowski. So we started by looking at what do children and their parents want from therapy, and do they want the same thing? And what was interesting is there was lots of similarity between children and parents. And what was really important is it was not all about not stammering. It was about confidence and happiness and friendships and participation. It's all the things that, I suppose, the holistic view of the person. And then we've just recently published a paper about their perspectives 1 year on. And again, what's really interesting is not only are they talking about the things they thought they wanted at the beginning, but there's a much bigger picture of the broad perspective of the whole person. So it's holistic, it's paying attention to what works, the good stuff. And there's a process over time in terms of desensitization as well, but very much at the client's pace.
Yes. And one question that I know that some therapists will have is, in which range of ages can I use this? Like with teenagers, children?
Yeah, it's suitable for all ages. So I think often people start by learning about it and thinking about using it with adults, but actually at the Michael Palin Centre, we use it with the whole age range. So with our Palin PCI approach, which is for the under 7s who stammer, I would say when they're really little and they may not be having conversations, we mainly have a solution-focused approach with parents. But as soon as a child is able to think and act out or play or draw something about what they hope for from therapy, you can start using it. So we have magic wands and drawing best hopes, rockets to the moon, ladders to think about, scales, and all sorts of creative ways that you can use it. So as soon as they can do that, you can start using solution focused conversation. And there's a lovely paper by a former colleague, Alison Berquez, about SFBT with children who
Yeah.
stammer, which is a really useful overview.
Yes, and it's a lot about find ways to adapt the activities to the little ones. For example, as you mentioned, with a scale when they ran from 0 to 10, and like to find better ways for the little ones to understand that.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's
in all sorts of ways. We have a stripy carpet in the centre, so there's lots of moving about and standing on different stripes, or moving up and down stairs, or having a washing line with numbers on it, just ways to make it fun and engaging, and using whatever you have that's going to make it a bit more concrete and tangible for the young person. So one of the ways that I find very easy is to just ask them to draw what it looks like, what they'll be doing. And one of the things about the SFBT conversation is to make it as concrete as possible. The more that the client can describe the detail of what it will look like, the more they begin to visualize it. And you can almost see them start to visualize it or start to smile as they describe that preferred future in detail.
Yes, yes. And another thing that I like about this approach is that when you work with others, you don't have to use only this approach to work with them. Like you can use it with ACT, for example, and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at the centre we really work in an integrated way. So solution focused work has really influenced us as a team in a direction of looking for what works and what we can do more of overall, but then it fits in a very complementary way alongside other therapies. I think one of the things we do with SF conversations is often in the first assessments we'll be asking about parents or children's best hopes from therapy. And then when we start therapy, we'll again revisit that idea of what do you want from coming here? What are your best hopes from working together? And then as we go along, we have lots of conversations, almost weekly. What have you been pleased to notice since we last met? And all the time you're helping the client, the family, to focus towards what's working, as opposed to focusing on what's not working. And then you're just building that bit by bit. So it's also really useful for reviews when you want to kind of think about where they've got to. You can do lists where you say, let's think of 20 or 30 things that you've been pleased to notice. And that really ups the ante, and they think, oh, wow, I can't possibly do that. And then they get started and they find they can.
Yes, yes. That activity, for example, can be also very. I remember when I had to do that, like mention 25 things, for example, and the person can get stuck in, I don't know, in the number 5, for example, and the idea is also to help them to realize there are more things that are doing well, and till they can fulfill the list, for example. So
those lovely questions like what else and what difference does that make? It's interesting because you might think, oh, I can only ask that once or twice, but then you ask it again and more emerges that the client hasn't necessarily realized was there. So you can get a really rich kind of depth in the conversation. And that what difference question, I think, is so helpful. What difference has that made, or what difference does that make? It just means they really start to think about the outcome, which is the really important part to help them focus on.
Yes, exactly. And it's very, I mean, apart from that, it's very interesting how during the conversation, the therapists also have this idea of, I'm not the expert of your life. It's like, I'm just going to help you, but we will work together. It's not, which is completely different also, because in other approaches, it's like the therapist is the expert and the client is the person who listens. But here they can take an active role. They are always doing some things, and that's also very, very good for them at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would hope that that really fits with the values that we have as a team. Sue Kimberg, who was one of the developers of SFBT, talked about the invisibility of the therapist. And she said that very probably well-known quote, leave no footprints in our clients' lives. So for me, when a job is well done, the client walks away and they don't need us any longer. So we empower them to walk into their own future. They are the expert. They're the only people who really know what they need at that particular moment. And then what we do is cooperate with them. And so we might need to kind of hold them in the process, especially parents when they're feeling highly anxious about their children who stammer. But gradually we probably step back and do less as they can step forwards and do more.
Yes, and that also fit a lot with, I mean, with the work that you also have, I mean, all the team at the Michael Palin Centre, because the way you work there is that we are not the expert. We help, we work together, and that's also very nice. I remember when I joined, one of the first lessons at your center was like, okay, this is very interesting, because here we're used to work in a different way. Of course, not completely different, but in that part of, I mean, here we are more used to the parent has to do this and don't have to do this. But there is more like the parents know what you are doing, what's the best for their children. We are only to help them to discover that and to realize that they know that already. So it's a completely different way to go to that point, which also very fit at the same time with ACT, with solution focused practice, and that's another very interesting thing that I noticed.
Yes, I mean the key is facilitate. So as opposed to being didactic, it's all about facilitating them to find the solutions for themselves. And interestingly, for some families, particularly where they may have a really kind of problem saturated narrative or are highly focused on not stammering, that can take quite a long time. And the important thing is to go at their pace. Sue Kimberg talked about it as leading from behind. But actually it's not exactly leading, because really all you're doing is holding and facilitating in a respectful way, so that they get to the place they need to get to over time.
Exactly. That's very, very interesting. I have never heard about that approach here in South America. I mean, I've applied with people who stammer. So when I was at the Michael Palin Centre, I was like, okay, this is very important. I want to learn more about this.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I think it's been really important to us as a team for many years. So I think for the past 20 years, it's really influenced the way we work.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, they're starting to work on research to see how this approach can really work for people who suffer, as you mentioned with Alison Berquez, for example. So that's very, very good as well, and necessary at the same time.
Yeah. Yes, it is. And I think it's still necessary for there to be more research. There are some trials in aphasia using solution-focused conversations, but there's still not a huge amount of research in speech and language therapy using SFBT.
Yes, exactly.
So there's a window of opportunity there for you.
Yes, and now that everything is online, it's also very nice for everybody too.
Yeah.
So, well, Thank you so much, Ali. As I was saying in Spanish, it's an honor to have you here on this video and to share a bit this approach with others.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Angélica.
Y muchas gracias a ustedes por haber visto este video, espero que les haya gustado. Si pueden ver, también van a encontrar en este canal diversos videos con otros expertos en el tema. Tenemos videos con Jane Harley, que le hemos mencionado en este video, tenemos con Scott Yarus, Marguita, etc. Así que los invito a visitar este canal y que puedan sacar toda la información que puedan de los videos que ya tenemos grabados. Muchas gracias una vez más y los invito a suscribirse y ya nos estamos viendo pronto.